Revolution and war. Here you can see Iraqis that have captured an Iranian M60 tank during the opening phases of the Iran-Iraq war. So we're going to look at theories that link domestic violence to international conflict, particularly revolutions. So the statistical evidence on revolutions war is that there's a weak but positive relationship between domestic conflict and foreign conflict. Generally, when domestic turmoil becomes violent or mass-based, the state becomes less likely to engage in external war. Basically, it doesn't have the resources to fight both a huge internal war and a large external war. So the logical link between domestic and external violence is complex. Some states are too domestically violent to be able to organize external violence. When a country is suffering famine and social dislocation like Somalia in the early 1990s, it was in no position to start a war against Ethiopia. Whereas when Ethiopia was suffering from revolution in the 1970s, it became the target of an attack by the Somali military. Some states are so domestically violent that they export violence without state sanction, leading to an interstate war. Pakistan's civil war in 1971, particularly in East Pakistan, led to millions of refugees fleeing from East Pakistan into India, and a belief by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of a need to invade East Pakistan in order to stop the flow of refugees, as well as to damage Pakistan's power. So India sponsored the Mukti Bahini resistance, who then infiltrated and fought against the Pakistan army. Some states are so domestically violent that other states attack it, believing it is weak. The Shah of Iran was able to force the 1975 Algiers peace agreement on Iraq by intervening in Iraq's civil war against the Kurds in the north. Saddam Hussein couldn't face both the Kurds and the Iranians, and so he negotiated this agreement, which led to significant humiliation for Iraq. Still, other states have leaders that use domestic violence and focuses outward. This is diversionary theory. Revolutionary and violent state formations are more likely to be involved in wars, following from cases between 1916 and 1965. So let's turn now and look at some of the theories of revolution and war. Now, Stephen Walt wrote a book called Revolutions and War, in which he developed the link between revolution and war. Walt's objective is to study why revolutions increase the likelihood of war. So we will apply this theory to the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War on September 22nd, 1980, which was to last until 1988 with at least 1 million dead, and it cost hundreds of billions of dollars. So a background to the Iran-Iraq conflict. Iraq, which is a majority Arab state with a Kurdish minority, is situated along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and is divided from Iran by the Zagros Mountains and what the Arabs call the Shatt al-Arab River and what the Iranians called the Arvand Rud. Conflict arose along this geographic divide, has been recurrent for 3,000 years. And it was probably one of the most violent frontiers in the Near East, typically between the Ottoman Turks and the Persians. And it was most recently delineated after the British occupied Iraq in the 1920s. The departure of the British in the 1950s from Iraq permitted a resumption of hostilities along that frontier, particularly since both states had large supplies and reserves of oil located near that water barrier. In the north, the Iraqis had the Kirkuk oil field, which had pipelines that then went down the Shatt al-Arab. And the Iranians had their oil in Khuzestan or Arabistan near the city of Abadan, which was also very closely related to that river. So you can see here the two black spots, the one on the top and the one to the east, are the Kirkuk and the oil fields around Abadan. and you can see a blue line near the border that basically goes up from the southeast to the northwest, which is the Shat al Arab, or the Arvand Rud. And it's the river over which their common oil supplies went out to sea. So these two states got a lot of their revenue exported on a very vulnerable choke point that was mutually vulnerable to the other side. Iraq had repeatedly provoked tension along the frontier with Iran in the 1950s and 1960s, which erupted in 1969 with Iranian support to a Kurdish revolt in Iraq. After 6 years of punishing warfare, Saddam Hussein conceded Iraq's defeat and negotiated the 1975 Algiers Accord with the Shah of Iran, in which Iraq ceded control of the Shat al Arab to Iran. The economic boom in the 1960s and 1970s in Iran brought millions of poor migrant workers from the rural areas into the cities, which, when the economy collapsed in the late 1970s, led to massive unemployment and a popular rebellion against the Shah's rule. The bazaar merchants and traditional Islamic clerics formed a coalition against the Shah, as did the two-day Communist Party, and the middle class withdrew their support from the Shah. On September 8, 1978, the army failed in its attempt to quell the popular uprising. They basically refused, which prompted the Shah to escape Iran on January 16, 1979, and for the arrival of the Ayatollah Khomeini on February 1, 1979. Now, the principal alternative explanation is, and this lacks evidence, is that one, revolutionary ideology causes war. And there's little evidence of this, nor explanation of how the ideology leads to war. Two, domestic political explanation, that revolutions usually contain two groups competing for power, and war results because in their conflict they blame outside powers in order to rally their domestic populations to the revolutionary cause. And three, revolutionary personalities are violent and aggressively war-prone. They learn about war and then they apply it when they achieve power. So let's look at some definitions. From Theda Skocpol, we have: a revolution is a destruction of an existing state by members of its own society, followed by the creation of a new political order. This excludes coups d'etats, pure national liberation fronts against foreigners, and civil orders without the advocacy of a new political order. And there's two types. There's a mass revolution, and these are revolutions from below, normally political participation by groups that were excluded under the previous regime. And there are also elite revolutions. These are social revolutions that occur from above. Old regimes are challenged by new movements whose leaders are basically former members of the older regime. We can see this in Kemal Ataturk and his radical reforms in Turkey, or the Meiji Restoration of Japan in the 1870s that led to the conditions of industrialization. We are going to focus only on mass revolutions. So the general explanation that Walt poses is that revolutions change the distribution of power in the international system because they make revolutionary states weak. And they can be infectious, resulting in external reactions ranging from accommodation to intervention. So Walt's definition of a revolution is defined as destruction and replacement of a state by members of its own society. So here are the different variables in Walt's model. So you have a revolution, it's the antecedent variable, and it creates one intervening variable, windows of opportunity. Countries that were normally strong are now weak. So if there are other countries that have plans against the country, this is the time to move against them. Two, there's uncertainty. The country before the revolution had allies. It was a part of organizations and alliances. After the revolution, it's lost all of its allies. It's vulnerable. So there's uncertainty about what new alliance this state is going to join. The third intervening variable is that the window of opportunity and uncertainty creates weakness in the state. The state is alone and disorganized. The fourth intervening variable is the mind of the revolutionaries. Revolutionaries struggle to survive and win, and they use the same lessons in their foreign policy. And these variables combined together create a decision for war. So the first step is, how do revolutionaries behave? Well, there's different components. Number one, the administrative capacity of the state is weakened following the revolution because the new revolutionary leaders don't have the same skill to lead the state. They're not economists, they're not technocrats. Hundreds of thousands of middle-class Iranians, for example, and supporters of the Shah either fled Iran or did not return from their foreign studies. Thousands of military officers and technical personnel were executed. Radical students took over positions in government, and fanatical religious followers formed Iran's new army. Second, revolutions require successful political activity to overcome the collective action problem. The fact that almost all citizens want the government to change, but are themselves afraid of the consequences of being captured and death, makes it difficult to organize. This is solved by the threefold propaganda of revolutionary movements. First, they describe their opponents as evil, including the old regime and external states that supported the old regime, including former allies. The Ayatollah described Iran as the state of infidels, and he called the Iraq Shiites in Iraq to revolt. The revolutionaries claim the victory is inevitable. It's chosen by God, it's chosen by history, it's chosen by the inevitable change in the modes of production. 3. The revolutionaries proclaim the universal applicability of the revolution. This revolution applies not just to Iran or China or Russia, it applies to all states everywhere. You can see here the martyrdom of Hussein in 680. Every day is Ashura, every day is Karbala. The Ayatollah argued that an Islamic jihad would sweep away injustice and install a just new order, and that those who died in its cause would be rewarded with paradise. Now, number 3. The violence experienced during the revolution generally makes revolutionaries extremists, either because they had to adapt to the violence or because the more extreme revolutionaries survived and replaced those who were more accommodating. The revolution itself initially consisted in Iran of a wide spectrum of supporters, including the middle class, represented by Bakhtiar, the moderate left, represented by Bani Sadr, the Tudeh Party, which is a communist party indigenous to Iran that was responsive somewhat to the Soviet Union, and the clerics, mostly concentrated in the city of Qum, within which there was actually a range of views. As the clerics had the support of the masses of the urban unemployed, Bakhtiar found the middle class could not negotiate with the other groups, and so he fled to Paris. Eventually, he was assassinated, although his head has never been found. The atheist Tudeh Party, which held considerable influence among the oil workers, which had a lot of influence because they could go on strike, and they had a sophisticated terrorist network in the form of the Mujahideen, became the target of the clerics, and were basically wiped out or forced to go underground. Leftist Bani Sadr managed to negotiate his way into the government in 1979 and 1980, but eventually he also lost political power. With each successive stage of wiping out their opponents, Iran moved more and more closely to an unrestrained theocracy, ultimately to be led by one group of clerics. The policy effect of this, once a revolution is consolidated, is threefold. 1, revolutionaries overrate the possibility of success because they come to believe their own revolutionary ideology. This is called blowback, when you start to believe your own stories. 2, their fragile hold on power and their generally vulnerable position encourages them to seek to spread the revolutionary ideology before it's extinguished by reactionary elements both within society and outside society. Number 3, because of their sense of vulnerability, revolutionaries become hostile to external states that they suspect of harboring exiles. Now, there are so many exiles that flee to the neighboring countries, just about every neighboring country becomes a target. Many of Iran's senior military leaders under the Shah fled to Iraq and provided military secrets and advised the Iraqi leadership, including Saddam Hussein, to attack while Iran was free. Iran claimed that Iraq was providing assistance to these anti-revolutionary elements. Now obviously these exiles were hoping to go back to Iran, even if it meant riding in on Iraqi tanks. The second step in the analysis is understanding how states see each other as threats. An important element of Walt's theory is, as we've seen before, the balance of threat theory. This is a realist theory that argues that states calculate threats from other states three cumulative ways. 1. Aggregate capability. How strong is the other state in terms of relative power? This, of course, is part of the balance of power calculus. 2. The perception of the intent of the other state. Is the other state passive or is it aggressive? And 3. The offense-defense balance. Are the weapons of the enemy better used in the attack than in the defense? And does it make them more likely to attack? So the main hypothesis for Walt is that revolutions increase the likelihood of war by the following. 1. It creates the fear of the spread of the revolution. Walt finds that revolutionary states speak aggressively, but he finds that they do not act aggressively. Revolutionary states are typically the victims of an attack from the outside. Although Iran was calling for a jihad, its military had largely collapsed. And what remained of its military was trying to contain separatist movements in Iranian Azerbaijan and Iranian Kurdistan, as well as Iranian Arabistan. There were no military preparations to attack anyone outside Iran. Number 2. You have the creation of conflict of interests between the new regime and old allies. Iran's old ally was the US, and on some level Saudi Arabia. This is due mainly because the revolutionaries assume that external states are hostile, because it is there that the defeated elites have fled. So the Shah fled to France, and then later he went to the US. And also because revolutionary sympathizers in these external states typically encourage the spread of the revolution. So Iraqi Shiites looked favorably upon the revolution in Iran and requested help to spread the revolution into southern Iraq. Now Iran number 3. Uncertainty pervades all of these calculations because, of course, the old diplomatic lines of communications are disrupted and are unavailable. Prior commitments through treaties are disrupted, and external states have difficulty judging the policies of the new state. Iran lost the ability to contact its former allies, such as the US or Israel, and therefore became isolated. Number 4. These revolutionary disruptions create changes in power and windows of opportunity. The first component, revolutionary states, because they've come to believe their ideology, tend to aggressively push for the spread of the revolution. They believe they must expand early while they still have revolutionary energy and before they're attacked by non-revolutionary reactionary states. The second component, non-revolutionary states see the revolutionary movements as initially weak and slowly consolidating and getting stronger over time, and therefore have an incentive to attack it as early as possible. They are often encouraged to do so by the threatening comments of the revolutionaries, and they're encouraged by exiles that are fleeing the revolutionary state that indeed this state is weak. These insecurities eventually lead to war, typically by the non-revolutionary states invading the revolutionary state. Saddam Hussein was initially very cautious with the regime. He affirmed past treaties. He had no plan to attack Iran. It was not until there was clear evidence of Iranian support to Iraqi Shiites that Saddam decided to strike at Iran before he believed that Iran would attack anyway. So Saddam Hussein approved a three-pronged attack. One to the north, to consolidate Iraqi Kurdistan, where most of Iraq's oil came from. The center up to the Zagros Mountains to protect the approaches to Baghdad, which were fairly flat. And into Khuzestan or Arabistan in the south, which contained an Arab population that might revolt for Saddam Hussein, and where most of Iran's oil came from. Now, no revolutionary wars happen when there is strong defense dominance. So that exporting the revolution because of geography or sociology can sometimes be difficult. So here are cases of revolution. The French Revolution, in which almost all of its neighbors attacked. The Mexican Revolution, in which the US attacked under General Pershing. The Russian Revolution, in which even Canadian soldiers invaded at Vladivostok, along with the Japanese, and the British invaded through Murmansk. The Turkish Revolution, which involved a Greek invasion. The Cuban Revolution, which involved the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs attack. The Ethiopian Revolution, in which the Somalis invaded. The Cambodian Khmer Rouge revolt, in which Vietnam invaded and took over Cambodia. The Nicaraguan Revolution, in which the US sponsored the Contras out of Honduras to disrupt the economy. And finally, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, in which Iraq invaded. So here you can see a depiction of the neighbors of France invading during the French Revolution. You can also see on the right different countries invading European Russia. In fact, my military unit, which was 16th Field Squadron, where I served for 15 years, invaded Vladivostok, a city in Siberia, and did it in conjunction with Americans and Japanese soldiers. The Japanese advanced all the way to Lake Baikal, near Irkutsk in Siberia. In fact, Iran had a revolution earlier and was also invaded. In 1905 to 1911, Iran had a constitutional revolution. Iran was suffering decline, which some members of the elite looked down on severely. There was high corruption and inefficiency. There was extensive foreign control, particularly between the English and the Russians, termed the Great Game. There was a general improvement in education, so people were more likely to intervene in the public events, and there was an economic crisis. And so there was a demand for a constitution and a parliamentary regime, but this ultimately led to an invasion by Russia because the disruption had weakened Iran. Now, not all revolutions lead to the revolutionary state getting attacked. There are cases where revolutionary states are the first to attack abroad. Ibn Saud, who was involved in a revolution in Arabia, and the Ikhwan, who were his holy warriors, were essentially Wahhabists, and they wanted to recreate Greater Syria, which would have meant uniting Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, the other Gulf states, and Arabia, possibly Lebanon as well. So they led an attack to capture a Mediterranean port. At that time, you had the Arab Legion, which was a British-sponsored force led by Glub Pasha in Amman, Jordan, at that time called Transjordan. And so the Ikhwan clashed and ultimately was defeated and never established its Mediterranean port. Also, the Chinese Communist Revolution, which was consolidated in 1949, was not attacked. China ultimately intervened in the Korean War in 1950. Not all revolutions result in war. In the English Revolution, in which England's king was beheaded and Cromwell was installed, because England was an island, there was no foreign intervention. The Italian Wars of Unification, which can be seen as a revolution because it completely changed the political order, was very strongly supported by the population, the intellectuals, as well as by local priests who used the common language of Latin in the church to unify the disparate languages of Italy. The Chinese Revolution that culminated in 1911 also didn't have a foreign invasion because the Japanese judged that a post-revolutionary France was a lot more cooperative than the pre-revolutionary Manchu dynasty. The Mexican Civil Wars didn't have American intervention, although you did have a punitive raid by General Pershing in retaliation for Mexican raids into the U.S. in 1915-1916. The Spanish Civil War in 1936 was isolated by European navies, but was not targeted. You can see down here the monarch of England who had his head chopped off on the right, and on the left you can see Cromwell who took over. Here you have Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who funded and organized the revolution of 1911. It took many years of preparation, but ultimately he lost power to Yuan Shikai, who was the senior Chinese general in service of the Manchu dynasty, who then shifted his allegiance, causing the Manchu dynasty to fall. And then he later had a bid to be first emperor and then president of China. So there is an alternative explanation. And the first hypothesis is that wars happen because revolutionary states attacked their neighbors. Now this is not empirically supported because revolutionary states are usually not the aggressors but the victims. Another alternative hypothesis is that domestic divisions within the revolution lead to elite or popular scapegoating, in which foreigners are blamed and war is therefore exported. Again, this is not empirically supported because revolutionary states are usually not the aggressors but the victims of attack. Now there are two policy illusions that very often infect revolutionaries. The first is that exporting revolution is easy. In fact, revolution being exported is very difficult because of the balance of power and the very rare and particular domestic conditions in one state that caused the revolution are usually dissimilar from the domestic circumstances in another state. And we can think of Simon Bolivar, who helped liberate much of South America from the Spanish, and how difficult it was in the different regions for him to operate. The second illusion is interventions are easy. In fact, interventions to stop revolutions are very difficult. States should be careful not to exaggerate the likelihood of a successful intervention. So what does Walt's theory tell us about appropriate policies to adopt if a revolution were to occur in a pivotal state like, say, for example, Saudi Arabia? What should the U.S. do? Saudi Arabia is enormously important because of the concentration of oil. Should Americans intervene, or should they allow the domestic politics to run its course? So what are some of the criticisms of Walt's revolution and war? Well, one, it is possible that the state would have gone to war anyway. I had a student of mine several years ago who did a paper on the French Revolution, and he showed that the French Revolution made no difference. France was on the verge of a systemic war anyway because of the resources it had accumulated. France probably had a bigger population than Russia even. So it was a major demographic state in the heart of Europe. Had the revolution not occurred, the French monarchy was going to be the agent to start the wars that Napoleon ultimately executed. Number two, Walt's notion of revolution is very normative. Revolution implies away from the norm as opposed towards a norm. Revolutions that bring states closer ideologically don't cause war. So we can think of the Romanian Revolution in 1990 and the Russian Revolution in 1991, the collapse of communism in most of Eastern Europe, the movements in other parts of the world, like Kyrgyzstan, where you've had color revolutions in the Ukraine. These countries are moving towards the regional norm. And so they gather allies automatically by trying to overthrow the system. And so they don't end up getting attacked. In fact, they end up receiving external assistance as a consequence. Number three, revolutions do not lead to war if the revolutionary state is extremely weak and of no consequence. So Walt, of course, ignores the role of the system. Number four, some of these new revolutionary states do not create uncertainty, but they immediately seek an alliance during or immediately after the revolution. The revolution in Nicaragua in 1978-79, the Cuban Revolution, these countries immediately swung over to the communist world and the Soviet Union for assistance. Now, Edmund Burke was an Anglo-English writer who wrote extensively on the French Revolution in a very profound way, and a very, very good political theorist on the impact of destroying institutions. And we also have Crane Brinton's book on revolution, in which he formulated the idea of a Thermadorian reaction. So a second theory that links revolution to war argues that it is the domestic cycle of revolutions that produces war. So in this theory, it is the revolutionary state that initiates the war, and it's based metaphorically on an extrapolation of the French Revolution of 1789. So you have first the old regime in step 1, and you've got a pre-revolutionary government. In step 2, you have a spontaneous revolt. A military or a bourgeois or a peasant or an urban worker revolt installs a new revolutionary government. In stage 3, you have the rule and the demise of the moderates. The moderate revolutionary leaders encounter problems while seeking to domestically consolidate the revolution, but are delegitimized as compromising with members of the old regime. Here you can see Sylvain Bailly, who's organizing the tennis court oath during the early stages of the French Revolution. In stage 4, you have the rise of the extremists and the reign of terror. Extremist revolutionaries seize control of the government and seek to create a purified leadership that leads to a reign of terror that ultimately consumes the extremists themselves. This is the painting of the death of Marat in 1793, murdered by Charlotte Corday. These extremists are sincere, but they end up killing each other, and it leads to domestic chaos. Edmund Burke wrote about this aspect, the destruction of conservative institutions, which then opens up the country to basically chaos. And this level of disruption then leads people to demand a return to order. And finally, we have the Thermadorian reaction. The revolutionaries had renamed the months, and Thermidor was the month when the military took over. So the Thermadorian reaction is that the domestic accuracy in the state leads to a complete breakdown of legitimacy of the revolutionary government, and in that vacuum, the pre-revolutionary military take over. In the case of France, this consisted of Napoleon. With the military now in charge, the state behaved as a military state, which we looked at earlier, which was prone to escalation. The solution for the Thermadorian reaction, or Bonapartism, or the military taking over and consolidating power in a revolutionary state and then starting a war, is, of course, the Concert of Europe, which was the peace that came after the defeat of Napoleon, and it consisted of suppressing all revolutionary movements in Europe, particularly the revolutions that swept through Europe in 1833, and again the bigger revolutions that attempted to occur in 1848. And the idea was, revolutions themselves are not dangerous, but they cause disruption that leads to despotic seizures of governments by the militaries, and that then leads to war.